Lowndes County, Alabama, February 1853. When the census takers reached the Pierce plantation that winter, they recorded 1,000 acres of cotton, 63 enslaved people, and a household that appeared, at least on paper, to be thriving. But numbers cannot speak, and if they could, they would have trembled before the woman who lived at the edge of those fields. Her name was Letty, though in the ledgers she appeared as Letitia, property of Elijah Pierce. She stood nearly 7 feet tall, her back broad as a doorframe, her hands calloused from years of lifting the harvest others claimed as theirs. And she did not speak, not a single word anyone could remember, not to the mistress, not to the overseer, not even to the other enslaved people who shared her cabin by the river. Locals said she'd been silent since the night her first child was born and taken away before sunrise. By the time Elijah Pierce returned from Mobile 2 days later, the infant had vanished, sold south through New Orleans. When he asked why the mother made no protest, the overseer said, "She just stood there, sir, like a statue built out of grief." From that day forward, silence became her armor. Before we continue with the story of the woman they called the Giant of Lowndes, take a moment to join this investigation. Subscribe to History in Chains and ring the notification bell, because the stories buried in plantation ledgers still speak, and they remind us how memory resists erasure even when voices are taken. Leave a comment below. How do you think silence can survive longer than sound? Elijah Pierce inherited his land and his cruelty from his father. He believed discipline was proof of civilization. To him, the Pierce plantation was a demonstration of order. Cotton rose straight as commandments, people arranged by strength, and fear distributed like rations. He was 49 when the story began, wealthy, respected, and entirely unaware that the order he prized was rotting from within. Letty had borne 9 children in 14 years. Each time she carried to term, each time the newborn drew its first breath, Pierce found reason to move the infant elsewhere, to another plantation he owned, to a creditor, to a relative in need of help. He told himself it was business. He told his wife it was charity. But those who worked the fields knew the truth. He was selling the children of his own making. Whispers moved through the quarters that Pierce fathered many of the babies born there, though none dared say so aloud. Except perhaps Letty, whose silence was louder than accusation. By 1853, 8 of her children were gone. Only the youngest, a girl named Ruth, remained on the property, hidden by midwives and disguised as another woman's child. At night, Letty would sit outside her cabin and hum deep in her throat. Not quite song, not quite moan. A vibration that carried across the quarters like a secret prayer. Ruth would fall asleep against her mother's chest to that sound, believing it meant safety. In March, Elijah Pierce discovered the deception. He had returned from Montgomery, furious over a shipment lost to floodwater, and noticed the child fetching water for the kitchen. He demanded to know whose daughter she was. The cook hesitated, and in that pause the truth was revealed. Witnesses later recalled his voice echoing through the yard. "She belongs to me." He ordered Ruth removed that same evening. Letty did not fight, did not scream. She simply placed herself between the overseer and the door, her frame filling the doorway like a fortress. The overseer raised his whip. Those watching swore they saw her eyes change. Not rage, not despair, but something colder, a decision made beneath centuries of pain. She stepped aside. The child was taken. That was the last anyone saw of Ruth Pierce. After that night, Letty stopped even humming. Through the long summer, the plantation labored under a strange quiet. Animals grew restless. Workers moved slower, glancing toward the tree line as if expecting the air itself to break. When the first killing happened, few were surprised. The overseer was found face down beside the cotton press, his neck bent at an impossible angle. No one claimed to have seen anything. Elijah Pierce blamed another slave, a field hand named Jonas, and had him whipped to death as warning. But within weeks, the foreman died the same way. Neck crushed, eyes open, no weapon nearby. Rumors began to circulate that a spirit had risen in the fields. They called it the Silent One. Pierce laughed at the superstition. He said order would return once fear burned itself out. It did not. By harvest season, 4 more men were dead, each found near the tool shed, the cotton gin, the granary, or the slave jail. Each killed without noise. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Those who had participated in taking Letty's children were dying one by one. Their throats collapsed as if the air itself had turned against them. On October 9th, 1853, Pierce gathered his remaining staff in the big house and declared that the next attack would be met with biblical vengeance. He ordered guards to patrol through the night and forbade any slave from leaving their cabin. That evening, thunder rolled across the fields, but no rain fell. Lightning illuminated the riverbank, where Letty stood alone, head tilted toward the sky. Witnesses later swore that each flash made her appear taller. Near midnight, a scream cut through the stormless dark. By dawn, Pierce himself was missing. His horse returned riderless, saddle slick with rain that had never fallen. The search lasted 3 days before someone found his boots sticking from a shallow pit behind the barn. A grave half filled with clay, the body buried upright as if planted. His neck, too, was broken. No trial followed. No patrols came. The Pierce family left Alabama within a month, leaving the estate to rot. Those who remained said Letty walked into the woods and was never seen again. For nearly a decade, the land lay abandoned. Then, after the Civil War, freed people returned to farm small plots near the old plantation. They discovered 9 earthen mounds arranged in a crescent near the river, each topped with a flat stone. No one knew who placed them there, but the count was exact. 9 graves, 1 for each child. Some said the earth itself had risen to mark what Pierce had done. Others said Letty had buried her own silence there. In 1866, a Freedmen's Bureau officer named Captain Elias Ransom recorded the site. His report reads, "Found large colored woman, mute, tending 9 graves, name uncertain. Locals speak of her with awe and fear." He concluded, "This testimony cannot be written in ordinary terms." That entry became the first official record of the legend historians would later call the Whisper of Lowndes County. By the time the Bureau withdrew, the story had spread across Alabama. Children whispered that the giant woman still roamed the riverbank, waiting for someone to ask her the right question. But no one dared, until one reporter arrived, determined to try. In 1867, Northern journalist Samuel Harper rode south following rumors of strange hauntings left behind by slavery's collapse. He had heard of the silent woman who spoke only once and wanted to know what her words had been. What he found would alter every assumption he had about guilt, grace, and the price of remembering. Samuel Harper arrived in Lowndes County at the edge of spring, 1867. The road from Montgomery was a corridor of ruin, fields scorched by years of war, chimneys standing alone where houses once rose, the air heavy with the silence that follows collective guilt. He'd come south before, as a correspondent covering Sherman's march. But this was different. He wasn't chasing battles anymore. He was chasing ghosts. When he asked the bureau officers about the silent woman, they shook their heads. "You'll find her by the river," one said, "but don't expect conversation. Folks say she doesn't talk to the living." Harper smiled. Journalists thrived on impossible stories. He packed his notebook, his fountain pen, and a pistol he hoped he wouldn't need, then followed the river road until the trees grew thick and the road turned to mud. He found her standing among the 9 mounds described in the reports. She was older than he expected, her back slightly stooped, her hair white as cotton tufts bursting from dry pods. The stones at her feet were clean, their surfaces polished by rain or devotion. She did not turn when he approached. "Ma'am," he said softly, "I'm here to understand." She moved one hand across the nearest stone, brushing away dust. He tried again. "They say you haven't spoken in 20 years. Is that true?" She straightened, towering over him by nearly a head, and turned slowly. Her eyes were a color he couldn't name, not brown, not gray, but something forged by grief too old for light to touch. "I've been told," Harper continued, "that you know what happened here, that you buried these children." Her gaze drifted toward the water, where the river curled like a sleeping serpent. Harper waited. The only sounds were cicadas and the pulse of his own heart. Finally, she raised a single finger to her lips. Not a plea for quiet, but a command that silenced even the insects. Then she spoke. It wasn't loud, it wasn't long. The sound was closer to breath than speech, a whisper shaped by patience and sorrow, so dense it trembled in the air. Harper leaned closer, straining to catch the words. When she finished, she touched the first stone with her left hand, and the last with her right. Then she sat in the dirt and began to weep. Harper stood frozen, notebook limp in his hand. He hadn't written anything. He wasn't sure he should. What she said had not been meant for publication. It had been confession, maybe absolution, maybe both. He returned to Montgomery that night, unable to sleep. By morning, he wrote a single line in his field journal. The giant woman spoke. She said what the master did to her daughters, and she made the earth remember. He never printed the details, only hints. That 9 graves marked a reckoning. That silence could be the purest form of testimony. His article appeared in the New York Tribune under the title, "The Silent Witness of Lowndes County." It told readers that some truths could only be carried by those who refused to forget. The piece drew national attention, not because it explained, but because it refused to. Within months, pilgrims began arriving. Freed people, preachers, abolitionists turned educators. They came to stand on the ridge and pray. Someone built a wooden cross at the edge of the clearing, then a small chapel beside it. The 9 stones became an altar. The woman, Letty, lived long enough to see it built. In her final months, she spent each morning cleaning the graves, each evening watching the river. In December 1867, the Bureau's final records noted her death. The entry was brief. Letitia, aged about 47, deceased, buried on site beside the 9 graves she tended. No cause of death was listed. Locals said she simply lay down between the mounds and went to sleep. The church kept her memory. Generations later, parishioners would say that when the wind swept through the trees, it spoke her name. But history has a way of erasing even miracles, unless someone insists on keeping them alive. By 1883, the plantation ruins were gone. In their place stood New Hope Baptist Church, built by freedmen and women who carried the legend like scripture. They told their children, "She never spoke until she whispered what the Master did, and the earth listened." Each Sunday, the congregation filed past the 9 stones on their way to service. No one dared move them. A brass plate nailed to the church door read, "L.W. Letty's work." The initials meant different things to different people. Letty's work, Letty's whisper, living witness. When Northern teachers from Tuskegee and Atlanta University began collecting testimonies from former slaves, they found her name appearing in county after county. Some said she'd been a healer, some said a prophet. One woman in Montgomery told a young field worker, "Miss Letty didn't bury bodies. She buried silence." The first written version of her story appeared in 1908 in a journal article by teacher Clara Baines, titled "The Silent Mother of Lowndes." Baines described visiting the ridge and finding the stones, tended as though by invisible hands. Her essay was dismissed by white editors as sentimental, but it circulated among black readers who knew the difference between myth and memory. By 1936, the Works Progress Administration began recording oral histories across the South. Interviewer Ellen Ray visited the same church and heard the story again, told by an elderly woman named Mercy Brown, said to be the granddaughter of one of Letty's lost daughters. "My grandma said the tall woman's whisper shook the ground," Mercy told her. "She said the Master's name out loud, so the devil would know where to find him." Ray's supervisor struck that line from the official transcript, calling it unfit for government publication. But Mercy kept repeating it in church meetings, ensuring the story would never vanish. Each generation reinterpreted the silence. During World War II, black soldiers from Alabama carried pebbles from the ridge in their pockets. They called them stones of remembrance. Letters home said, "Mama says Miss Letty's watching. Bullets can't find me if she remembers my name." In 1955, during the Montgomery bus boycott, activists held a candlelight vigil on the ridge. One of them, a young pastor named Isaiah Brooks, said, "She whispered once, and the world changed. We'll whisper too, freedom, justice, dignity, until the world hears us." Her legacy became part of the local DNA. Even those who didn't believe in ghosts believed in her message. Silence can be defiance when truth waits behind it. When the modern era arrived, history tried to formalize what faith had preserved. In the early 1980s, historian Dr. Rachel McCord rediscovered the Freedmen's Bureau notes, describing a mute woman tending 9 graves. She visited Lowndes County in 1986 and found the ridge exactly as it had been drawn in the 19th century sketches. The stones were aligned with mathematical precision, their surfaces smooth from a century of rain. Someone still cared for them. A folded handkerchief embroidered with LW lay at the center, untouched by rot. McCord interviewed Reverend Brooks, by then an old man, who gave her a cassette tape labeled Testimony, May 12, 1978. The recording captured Mercy Brown's great-granddaughter recounting the legend. Her voice trembled, but her words were clear. "My great-grandma said Letty whispered 9 names and 1 curse. The names were her daughters. The curse was truth. She said truth would never sleep again on that land." McCord's research, combined with the family's letters, became the foundation for a 1989 PBS documentary titled Whispers of the Ridge. It showed the 9 stones at dawn, the light creeping across them like breath returning to a body. Viewers around the country saw Alabama's soil not as ground but as archive. The film's closing line, spoken by narrator David Brown, Mercy's descendant, became iconic. She spoke once, and the world is still listening. In 1992, the state declared the ridge a protected heritage site. A bronze marker was installed reading Letty of Lowndes, Conde 1820-1867, born enslaved, mother of 9, spoke once. Her whisper endures in memory. Every April, families gather there for a ceremony called the Count. They recite the names of women lost to slavery, pausing after every 9th name for silence. The pause itself is prayer. As years passed, Letty's story entered textbooks and classrooms. College students wrote theses on her rhetoric of silence. Poets compared her to Antigone and Cassandra, women who defied empires with the truth of grief. Artists painted murals of her across Alabama towns. A towering woman, eyes closed, hair white as cotton, 9 stones glowing at her feet. Musicians turned her legend into hymns and spirituals. In Selma, a gospel choir sang, "She whispered freedom, and the earth replied Amen." The wind that crosses the ridge now carries both memory and warning. Locals say on stormy nights you can still hear a low voice counting to 9. Then, after a pause, a single word, remember. Epilogue. Lowndes County, Alabama, 2025. The church bell rings 9 times each April. At the 10th, the congregation falls silent. Blue ribbons flutter across the ridge, where the 9 stones remain exactly as they were placed a century and a half ago. Visitors come from across the country. Students, descendants, historians, and wanderers, all drawn by the same quiet gravity. Among them is Elena Brown, Mercy's great-great-granddaughter. She brings her young son to see the stones for the first time. The boy runs his hand along the carvings. "Is it true she never talked?" he asks. Elena nods. She waited until the world was ready to listen. Every detail of the old story has been verified by records. The Pierce plantation, the Bureau report, Harper's article. But proof was never the point. The point was survival. A mother who lost everything refused to let silence belong to her oppressor. She turned it into inheritance, a weapon of patience, a monument built from breath. Today, school children in Alabama learn her name beside Tubman and Truth. In Washington, D.C., at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, a single page from the Freedmen's Bureau ledger sits under glass. Its ink has faded, but the line remains legible. Letitia, mute, tending 9 graves. Beneath it, a small plaque reads, "The giant slave woman who spoke once and changed history." Outside the museum, wind rustles the flags along the mall. Somewhere far south, it travels over fields where cotton once grew and finds its way back to the ridge. The stones wait, polished by generations of hands. The air hums with quiet, the kind of quiet that feels alive. If you stand there long enough, you might hear it. A whisper rising from the earth, steady and calm, speaking 9 names that no time or cruelty could erase. It is not the cry of a ghost. It is the sound of history finally answering itself. Because Letty, the giant slave woman who never spoke, did not whisper for pity or revenge. She whispered for remembrance, so the world would never again confuse silence with consent, nor mistake patience for weakness. And that whisper, that single, defiant breath, still moves through every voice that tells her story. Before you leave this investigation, share it. Let others hear what the earth remembers. Like, comment, and subscribe to History in Chains for more stories that remind us how truth survives when everything else is buried. Tell us in the comments, what do you think silence means when it becomes the only language left for justice? Because sometimes history doesn't scream. Sometimes it whispers.